The photograph looks ordinary at first glance. A family of 5 stiffly posed in sepia tones, their faces locked in the solemn expressions typical of 1910. A mother, a father, 3 children, captured forever in the rigid stillness of an Edwardian parlor. But then your gaze drifts upward, toward the woman in the center. Her posture is correct, her dress is modest, but her eyes are wrong. They are too sharp, too alive, where the rest of the image has faded into the blurred edges of time. Her gaze cuts through the century as if the glass plate was etched yesterday. Historians, collectors, and casual viewers have all reported the same disturbing sensation. The longer you look at her, the more it feels like she's looking back. But the true horror doesn't lie in the stare itself. It lies in the fact that, according to official records, this woman should not have been alive when the photograph was taken, and that's only the beginning. Welcome to Truth Uncaged. Here we unearth the stories buried in forgotten archives, the strange cases dismissed by skeptics, and the unsettling truths hidden in plain sight. Tonight, we're diving into a photograph taken more than a century ago, a harmless family portrait that became a puzzle of history, death, and something far more chilling. Some claim it's nothing but a trick of early photography, an accident of light or chemical damage on the plate. Others believe it's proof that grief and desperation blurred the line between life and death in the most horrifying way imaginable. I want to know what you think. Do photographs sometimes capture more than the physical? Or are our minds simply filling in the gaps with fear? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because by the end of this story you may question whether you'd ever want to sit for a portrait like this one. Now, let's go back to the year 1910, when photography was not just an art, but an obsession, and sometimes a dangerous one. The year was 1910. Europe teetered on the edge of war. Technology was advancing at a dizzying pace, and the world was still tangled in the aftermath of the Victorian era. Families across Britain and America embraced the new magic of photography. Unlike today, photographs weren't casual snapshots. They were sacred records, often the only proof a person had ever lived. Many families would save money for years to afford just a single portrait. Death came quickly and often. Illness, accidents, poor medical care. That's why mourning portraits became common, families sitting beside the bodies of their deceased loved ones, propped up to appear alive, as if one last moment could be captured forever. The spiritualist movement was also in full swing. Seances were hosted in dimly lit parlors, mediums claimed to bridge the gap between worlds, and photographers often joined in, experimenting with spirit photography. Blurred figures, faint orbs, double exposures passed off as ghostly visitors. This was the culture into which the family portrait emerged. A photograph meant permanence. It meant proof, but it also meant that sometimes disturbing truths were hidden in the frame. Secrets only revealed decades later. And in this case, the secret was staring back at anyone who dared to look into the mother's eyes. At first, the photograph circulated quietly among collectors of Edwardian-era portraits. Nothing unusual, just another stiff family posed against a plain backdrop. But then one archivist noticed something strange. The father, the children, they were all consistent with the look of early photography. Slightly blurred edges, soft details, the natural imperfections of a century-old image. The mother, however, was different. Her face was sharp, too sharp. Her features seemed etched with an intensity no other figure in the portrait carried. But it wasn't the clarity that disturbed people most. It was the eyes. They didn't reflect light the way human eyes should in an old photograph. Instead, they appeared almost luminous, like tiny shards of glass catching a flame. Some who studied the photo swore they could see the pupils dilating, an impossibility in a still image. Others described the sensation of vertigo, as if her gaze pulled them into the photograph itself. At first, skeptics dismissed the detail. Maybe the camera caught her at the perfect moment, or perhaps the chemicals on the glass plate reacted differently with her face. A trick of exposure, nothing more. But then another discovery was made, something no technical explanation could easily dismiss. The image wasn't the only odd thing about the mother, because her name appeared in the local death registry, dated months before the photograph was allegedly taken. And suddenly, what had been dismissed as a quirk of old film became something far more disturbing. The discovery of the death record changed everything. No longer could this photograph be dismissed as an accident of exposure or a flaw in the chemicals. The official documents were clear. The mother, whose piercing stare haunted the portrait, had been buried months before the shutter ever clicked. Local historians began digging into the records. Parish ledgers, census rolls, even coroner's notes were pulled. The family was real, father, children, all accounted for, but the mother's timeline simply didn't fit. Neighbors recalled the funeral, the heavy black carriages, the mourning cloth draped across the windows of the family home. And yet, there she was, seated at the very heart of the portrait. Not frail, not fading, but composed, solid, terrifyingly alive. Photographic experts were called to examine the original plate. They searched for signs of double exposure, for evidence that the mother had been copied from an earlier photograph and superimposed onto the family portrait. Nothing. The chemical layers were consistent. The grain was uniform. From a purely technical standpoint, she had been there when the photograph was taken. But that begged the question, how? The family's descendants, contacted decades later, added another layer to the mystery. Stories had always circulated within the bloodline, whispers that their matriarch had been strange in her final years, that her illness had not been entirely of the body, but of the mind, or perhaps the spirit. Children had been warned never to speak of her eyes, or of the way she seemed to linger in the house long after she should have been gone. And so the photograph became more than a curiosity. It became evidence that either history was lying, or something impossible had been captured on that fragile sheet of glass. But this was only the beginning. The deeper investigators went, the darker the revelations became. The discovery hit like a hammer. Buried in the local records was the proof no one wanted to find. This woman, the very same figure staring so sharply from the portrait, had been dead for months before the photograph was taken. Her death certificate was clear. February 1910. The family portrait, dated July. At first, some dismissed it as a grim but common custom of the time, a mourning portrait. Families, too heartbroken to let go, sometimes posed with their dead. Bodies were propped up, painted, disguised as if they were still among the living. But if this was such a portrait, why did she look more alive than anyone else in the frame? Her posture was steady, her skin unnervingly clear, and those eyes, bright, glass-like and piercing, showed no trace of death. Instead, they radiated something closer to defiance. Then came a letter, hidden for decades, written by the family's eldest son. He described his mother's final weeks, her strange fixation with mirrors, her refusal to sleep, and her cryptic words that someone was waiting for her in the reflection. After her burial, he claimed, the children still heard her voice at night. Not in dreams, not in imagination, but in the halls calling their names. Suddenly, the portrait no longer seemed like grief captured on glass. It felt like evidence that whatever haunted the family had followed them into that photograph. And the deeper historians looked, the more disturbing the trail became. The photograph should have been the end of it. A strange curiosity explained away a superstition or grief. But the more researchers dug, the more the family's story began to unravel, and the picture became a window into something far darker. Neighbors' accounts surfaced, tucked away in brittle newspapers and parish notes. They spoke of unsettling things, the children waking with unexplained fevers, the father refusing to enter certain rooms after nightfall, and the sound of footsteps pacing the upstairs floor long after the mother had been laid to rest. One neighbor recalled seeing her weeks after the funeral, standing by the window in her black dress, staring into the street. When questioned, the family denied it, but whispers spread quickly. The mother was still in that house. Even stranger, 2 years later, the family abruptly moved. No farewell notices in the papers, no explanation. The house itself was left abandoned, its curtains drawn tight as if keeping something locked inside. And then there were the other photographs. Archivists uncovered 2 additional portraits of the children taken after the family relocated. In both images, something unusual appeared. A shadow, faint but visible, hovering just behind them. When the photos were magnified, the shape seemed disturbingly familiar. The outline of a woman, her gaze fixed directly on the lens. By now, the portrait was no longer just a relic of grief. It was evidence of a haunting, one that didn't stop with the mother's death, or even with the shutter's click. And still, the question remained, what exactly had those children been forced to live with? Decades passed, but the photograph refused to fade into obscurity. Collectors passed it from hand to hand, each drawn to the same unsettling detail, the mother's gaze. Even in an age where technology could explain away most mysteries, this one remained stubborn, resistant to logic. In the 1970s, the portrait was re-examined by photography historians. They tested the glass plate for chemical flaws, for signs of tampering, even for evidence of deliberate forgery. Every test came back ordinary. The emulsion was stable, the exposure consistent. By all scientific measures, the woman had been present when the shutter clicked. Then came the digital age. The image resurfaced online, spreading across forums dedicated to the paranormal. Some viewers dismissed it as a trick of contrast, a peculiarity of early film. But others reported something far stranger. They claimed that when the photograph was left on screen too long, the mother's expression seemed to shift, the corners of her mouth tightening. Her eyes growing wider. Artificial intelligence was even used to analyze the portrait. Modern algorithms can often recreate faces, smooth distortions, correct anomalies. But here the results were unsettling. The AI repeatedly failed to process her eyes, spitting out fragmented, distorted shapes instead of pupils. It was as if the technology could not recognize what it was seeing, and so the photograph persists. Not as proof, perhaps, but as a reminder that some images carry more than just light and shadow, that sometimes a family portrait doesn't capture who was there, but who refused to leave. Perhaps the most disturbing part of this story isn't the photograph itself. It isn't the records that prove she was dead, or the whispers of neighbors who swore they saw her after burial. It isn't even the faint shadow that seemed to follow her children into later portraits. The real horror lies in the question it forces us to ask. What if photographs do more than capture faces? What if they trap something else? An echo of grief, a sliver of obsession, or the restless imprint of a soul unwilling to let go? For the family, the portrait may have been a symbol of love, of unity in the face of loss. But for us, more than a century later, it feels like a warning, a reminder that death does not always draw a clean boundary between the living and the gone. Sometimes it leaves threads behind, threads strong enough to tangle themselves into glass, silver, and paper. We like to believe that ghosts live in haunted houses, in dark forests, in abandoned asylums. But perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: ghosts can live in the ordinary. In the picture frame that hangs in your hallway, the album passed quietly from one generation to the next. So the next time you glance at an old family photograph, look carefully, look into the eyes, and ask yourself, is the person you see really gone? The final detail is what cements this photo as one of the most unsettling pieces of forgotten history. Look closely at the mother's face, not just her eyes this time, but her entire expression. At first it appears calm, even serene. Yet the longer you look, the more it feels wrong. Her lips are pressed together too tightly, her posture too stiff, as if she's forcing herself into a role she doesn't truly belong in. Some have described it as the look of someone desperately holding back a scream. Others say it's the look of someone who knows a secret and is daring you to notice. And then there's her gaze. It isn't directed at the camera at all, not really. It's angled just slightly past it, as though she's staring at someone or something standing in the room with them. Something the rest of the family either didn't see or pretended not to. This tiny, nearly invisible detail has fueled countless theories. Was the mother under some sort of trance? Was she signaling fear? Or was she the only one aware of a presence lurking just out of frame? What makes this so chilling is not what's visible, but what's implied. A single photograph should capture reality, a frozen moment in time. Yet this one feels alive, like it's hiding more than it shows. That's why over a century later, people still hesitate when they come across this image. They glance once, maybe twice, and then instinctively turn away. Because deep down, they know the photo isn't just a relic of the past. It's a question, a warning, a reminder that sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see, but what's looking back at you.